Coach Guthrie, and this is the Long Letter Podcast, episode 10, which is a pretty impressive feat. Most podcasts don't make it to this milestone.
Good job. You've arrived.
It's like 4 million podcasts. It's like the podcast is the equivalent of like that book you're always going to write, you know? And it, you know, best intentions. Anyways, we made it 10. This is a pretty good feeling. And here's to, tens of more. So this episode is exciting and different in the sense that for the first time that I've done this, I do not have an interview. I have a co-host, and I will have a co-host for the next, 8 or 9 sessions or whatever, because we're going to review a book. We're going to talk through a book. I don't know if we're going to review it, but we're going to discuss the book, Grace Can Lead Us Home. I believe the subtitle is A Christian Call to End Homelessness.
Nailed it.
It's not like I don't even have it in front of me or anything, which I actually don't. So anyways, speaking of co-host, my co-host today and for the rest of the series is Nate Judd. Nate, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Nate. I work at Gather. I live here in Lewis County, born and raised. Kind of been around at different times for almost 40 years now, coming up on. But have grown up here, love it here, raising my family here, invested in seeing this place be great.
Yeah.
And I'm part of Gather. I do a CBER program, which is a housing subsidy. So I work directly with those that are unhoused, along with the rest of the staff and different capacities as well.
And intentionally lining up housing, trying to get people into housing.
Yes. So that's been the last year, 3 months of really first time in my life, trying to help somebody navigate from
all that
unhoused to housed.
And I assume it's just really easy, right?
Yeah, I'm a pro.
So little background, like Nate and I grew up together, known each other for pretty much our whole lives. And I thought he would be a very good co-host for this particular topic. Not only does he work in it, you have pastoral experience that comes into play as you do your job, as well as your past experience. Mm-hmm. It's a very real situation for you. And like I said, you and I go ways back, so it seemed like a good fit for what we need to do. Now, for listeners, this is not the end of the interviews. I do have more lined up, but I am trying to kind of break it up a little bit. I've had a lot of interviews. They've gone relatively well, but they've all, the last few have been like pretty heavy emotionally. It takes a lot of emotional energy to
dive into someone's story.
Yeah. And I love their stories, and I love that the fact that most of the time I'm talking to these people, they're still alive. It's amazing. But it does come with some just an emotional toll that I know I feel working with them and talking to them about it. But I also know that like it could be a very rough podcast if I'm not one of those people that that could listen to like a true crime podcast where it's just one like terrible thing after another. I like to kind of mix it up. I like to and even though these stories are, people's stories are encouraging and they're life-giving, life's hard, and that's reflected in a lot of these interviews. So,
and this book isn't lighthearted.
No.
It does carry its own.
But it is a more, it's more of a discussion-oriented thing than it is just, these stories of overcoming trauma or homelessness, addiction, whatever. So,
it's intermixed in there.
So, all right, well, let's get started in the book. It's by author Kevin Nye. I'm not quite sure where he's working now, but I think at the time of this writing, he was working in L.A. at a place called The Center. That's a non-religious, I don't know what you call it, like organization for helping homelessness or addressing homelessness in L.A. And his introduction really starts kind of with how he ends up where he did. And I know, Nate, we had talked about this, you're reading the intro and you're feeling this affinity for all this. Like it really kind of rings true to you or resonates with you, I guess.
Yeah, he's on a track towards professional ministry, being a pastor, paid Christianity. And he's in the middle of, he's getting his master's degree. He's getting, ordained in the Nazarene church. And all the while he's working at, an organization that's, aimed at serving and helping people move into housing, and all that goes with it.
And he makes this shift that we can talk about as we get into it. One thing I want to we didn't quite get into, but before the introduction, he has kind of a forward or a preface talking about the language that we use to refer to these groups of people. So like we call them homeless, and he tries to avoid using that because that kind of associates the thing they're struggling with who they are.
Right.
And so he'll sometimes say like the unhoused population or people struggling with homelessness or experiencing homelessness. And I think that's a good reminder because it's the same type of like vocabulary that you have to be careful about. Even here at Gather, working with people who they're not addicts, they're people who experience like dealing with drug addiction or substance use disorder. Yeah. Tons of stuff like that. Now, I will say before people get like really mad, it's not a big deal. It's just a matter of trying to separate the person from their struggle.
Well, I think anytime you're talking about an issue like that, I think the reason you think about it is because the language can actually form how we feel or think about it. And I like that he said that he's never met anybody who's homeless or who's experiencing homelessness who was offended that somebody called them homeless. There's a quote. He says, "I don't care what you call us. I care what you're going to do about it."
Yeah. And that's like, I my very first interview with Brooke, we talked about that term addict. Mm-hmm. Now she referred to herself as an addict. I think it's really in the tone and the purpose of what you're trying to express with that. But it is important to kind of remember that the language that we use does frame the way it's discussed. And it's something to just keep in mind. But yeah, most people probably don't care. I think it's more of a semantic issue to kind of keep in mind as you want to be respectful and you want to work through these issues. So
nowadays there are people who will find themselves offended that you're intentionally trying to be sensitive with the language that you use, and I think that that's not helpful.
Right, just don't be a jerk. Let's just at a bare minimum, let's just respect how people want to be referred to. Yep. So the introduction. This kind of takes place in 2018, and he had kind of had this idea of going into the ministry. I believe he was going to Fuller Theological Seminary, and he realizes that he might feel kind of a call not to ministry, to working in the toward homeless populations and stuff like that, and it was weird to me to read that he had so little support, felt like he had so little support, with the exception of like his pastor and his wife. Mm-hmm. I'm assuming that he's running in Christian circles. Why would he experience that? Like you've been a pastor, you're now working in an organization that serves homeless population. Like
I mean, to speculate on it, I think there's a part of it that there's a camaraderie in it, and there's a sense of shared calling. And for somebody to question it or to move in another direction, there's a couple different reasons I could think that might make people uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. It could mean that they are feeling sensitive that they're not doing that work. Or it's hard to know exactly.
I mean, part of me has to wonder if we just don't value it differently.
Yeah.
Like a good and proper thing to do is to be a pastor.
Yeah.
And a slightly less prestigious thing to do is, serve in this other fashion. And he talks about that. And I guess I'll take a quick break here just to point out that this is obviously a book written by a Christian for Christians regarding homelessness, and it's both kind of a primer on a lot of the different things behind homelessness and all these intertwined issues, but it's also has some theological reflection on what this means. Now, I have listeners that are probably all over the spectrum of belief, unbelief, whatever. And I guess I would just encourage them. Like, this is a book I would recommend to anybody, not just somebody who's a Christian or whatever. And the reason why I think that is because, one, it's really short. It's a really easy book to like consume and understand. But two, there's a lot of information in here just in terms of perspective. I don't want to say unrelated, but sort of unrelated to his theological reflection on it. And it does make it useful to continue to listen to it or read it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And somewhat, too, we are still in a culture that has been shaped by some of the Christian ideas. And I think understanding it from that perspective can help.
Oh, yeah.
And maybe help speak into the lives of some Christians who maybe need to hear this message about the church, about Jesus, about his care for people.
Very subtle, by the way. You're doing great. All right. So here he is. He's at Fuller. He's decided that he's not going to continue in his ordination process. And it kind of starts with him going to what would have been his ordination process. Mm-hmm. And, as far as I can tell, it seems like a very emotional time for him. Like, he's really struggling. I imagine he has a lot of self-doubt about, am I making the right decision? Am I doing the right thing? And eventually they leave before it's over, it sounds like.
Yeah, they didn't make it all the way through.
No.
But he doesn't give a reason why.
No, he doesn't.
It's like a side note.
That's why I felt like it was kind of hard. Like he was just having a hard time.
Yeah.
But even so, as they exit, they run into a person that he kind of assumes is experiencing homelessness, as well as mental health issues, and engages with this person. And it's kind of interesting because the whole act of engaging with them, he talks about the tool sets he uses to help ground them because they're kind of like, there's certain things. And I've experienced this just as somebody who's been around Gather for a long time. And I'm sure you experience this in the work that you do every day, but they're really odd. They can say really weird things. It's like there's always usually a little bit of conspiratorial type stuff, and it doesn't track. And then he talks about grounding. Mm-hmm. Have you ever had to use grounding, or is that an experience that or maybe just explain grounding?
Yeah, just trying to bring attention to something that might help them come back to the place that you're at right now.
In the present moment.
So they can, depending on somebody's situation, sounds like this particular person was experiencing a situation where they're talking about stuff that wasn't actually in reality. So just trying to help them come back to the moment, the parking lot outside the church, right. Whatever it is that can kind of help to try to
communicate with this person.
Yep.
And
we're here with you right now.
Yeah. And bring them, like, it does help. And I've experienced that. There's a woman that used to come by quite a bit who could get into that sort of state where, I don't want to call it ranty but it's just like, you can't track what they're saying or whatever. But the minute I would start talking to her, if I looked her in the eyes, I'm in proximity to her, she would get back to talking to you. And it would be like, it would like kind of bring things back down to the ground a little bit, hence the name grounding. That was very useful in working with her.
One of the things I appreciate about the introduction too, is that he acknowledges that these situations are pretty much never easy. No matter how much you do it, there's always an awkwardness. There's always a little bit of unease and uncertainty. And that for one, that's okay. I think anytime we're engaging somebody and recognizing that there's pain and there's trauma or there's, these things, it does cause a little bit of discomfort.
It's a whole other game.
Even when you do it for a living.
Right.
Like it's still.
It's also not something to be afraid of.
No, it's not.
It's just odd.
Yep.
And he kind of goes on, he kind of gauges that this person was just looking for some interaction. And he provided that, talked to the person. They wander around. It sounds like they go to the church. They go into the church, which is always like, he doesn't explain what happens after that, but I can guess.
Oh, yeah.
I can imagine.
You've seen it.
And he looks, across the street where this guy had come from, and he's kind of seeing it as like a picture of his life right now, where he's got one foot in the church and one foot out on the street, and he's making this decision to go work out on the street.
Yeah.
And I thought that was like very telling. He says, excuse me. He says, this experience signaled to me a place that I would come to occupy, a place I believe God has put me, with one foot in that ordination service, called to serve and love the church, and one foot in the streets, where those whom the world has rejected sleep, suffer, and die. Whichever way I turn and face, one message continues to emerge: grace. And that's the whole point of this chapter, really, but the whole book. I mean, the title of the book is Grace Can Lead Us Home. And he will return to that grace over and over and over again. And he goes on to say that everything I have come to believe about God informs my advocacy for the unhoused, as well as the reverse is also true. As his more experience with the unhoused and different populations dealing with substance abuse or mental health issues, they are changing his theological categories to a certain degree. There's this sort of reorienting process going on.
Yeah, the revisioning of how things work.
Yeah. You got a highlighted part there?
Yeah, one of the things that stood out to me and why this book is so important is he quotes a Washington Post poll research done by Kaiser Research.
I've got that one highlighted too.
Yeah, that says that Christians are more than twice as likely as non-Christians to associate poverty with a lack of effort as opposed to difficult circumstances. And I think that's part of the mind shift that he's gone through. That it is interesting that statistic is has twice as much that Christians see that.
Right.
And it's just, yeah.
Which is like, so he goes into this, he talks about this because he's his tradition, at least while he was writing this book, was the Nazarene, Church of the Nazarene, which is a Wesleyan tradition. And, John Wesley and his brother Charles Wesley had a very interesting take on what they called prevenient grace. And I don't know if I probably got it highlighted, but I can't find it. I'll just do it off the top of my head. His idea, his concept of grace that pervades the book, that pervades his work, that pervades the way he sees people, is this idea of just God's unmerited favor right off the bat. And so the threads that he kind of weaves together here all kind of tie back to this concept of grace, in that just like he did nothing to earn grace, there is nothing that these populations need to do, that these people who are struggling need to do to earn the grace that it's like he's a conduit for the grace he's received.
Mm-hmm.
Is the best way I can put it. I don't think he put it that way, but it's so pervasive in his writing. And I think if you read the book from that perspective, just understanding that he's coming at it from a grace perspective, and he's not wrong. I think Christians especially have been sort of trained to size things up and figure out where to put blame. And it's everybody, not just Christians, but Christians are really good at it.
I think religion in general has a tendency to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
To, go back to when Jesus was walking around and the disciples say, who sinned, this person or their parents that caused them to be born blind? It's like, we can't help it.
You can't just jump ahead like that. We're not even. But no, you're not wrong though. I think there is this idea. Now, there's room for that. There's room for understanding like what's going on here. But the Christian faith specifically, in terms of this idea of grace, really kind of puts that to the side, and that's what he does. He practices this, what here at Gather we would call radical grace, this unmerited favor that we give to people. And he gets more specific about it, the types of people. And I can't remember if it's funny. I know we've read this and we've reviewed this, but which part is in the introduction? Which part is in chapter 1 here?
Yeah, I can jump ahead.
Yeah, that's
it's like,
and that's fine. This is what like we're here to do. So, anyways, so yeah, he opens with that. He talks about this, and then it kind of shifts later into his first date with his now wife. They're out. They decide they're gonna just go sightseeing in the car, and they take a wrong turn, and they end up on Skid Row. Now, I have heard about Skid Row. I mean, it's a term that's thrown out there a lot, but I don't think that I was aware, one, exactly what it was, and two, exactly how large it was. Because he says in here, it's like 50 square blocks of LA, almost 3 square miles dedicated to people that don't have a home, they're dealing with whatever. They get out of jail, and they don't have another place to go, they get taken on the 2 a.m. bus and dropped off in Skid Row.
Or delivered in a police cruiser.
Yeah.
This happens if they're sleeping on the street somewhere else, the police will pick them up and take them there and drop them off.
It's the only place you're allowed to be homeless in LA, or it is what he kind of says. Now, that ends up not being true as, COVID hits and things like disrupt all of these systems. And
yeah, I think the 2008 recession also caused a huge influx of homelessness all over, to the point it outgrew the area that is designated.
Yeah, he talks about Reverend Kelvin Sauls saying, in the so-called City of Angels, hell's half acre is expanding its territory. Hell is winning. And he says in the 2008 recession, Skid Row could no longer contain the number of people experiencing homelessness, and encampments begin to form all across the city. So, which is, you have these events that occur that displace a lot of people. I remember I was working in Olympia 2001 when we had that big earthquake that kind of came through. And shortly after that, you just had people all over, like it seemed. And I don't know the connection to the earthquake. It just seemed to be the starting point of this influx of homelessness in downtown Olympia. And, then we've had the 2008 recession, we've had COVID, we've had housing crisis, we just had so many things. It's just compiling onto that.
I think looking directly at the recession in 2008 helps too, to recognize like when housing gets harder, you end up with more people who are unhoused. Like that seems to make almost too much sense, that people shouldn't be able to not recognize it, but It still feels like that itself is not always recognized by people, that homelessness increases as housing gets harder to find.
Yeah.
Or afford.
It's literally in the name.
Right.
So, I've recently written about that, and it's, it is hard. And the other things and we'll get into this is he talks about this a lot in the book, but this idea that how do we address somebody's mental health issues, or how do we address their substance use issues if they're not stably housed? Oh, and we'll side that, because I know that we're going to get into that pretty far. But yeah, he kind of goes into a lot of this stuff. He talks about going to seminary and reading the Minor Prophets, which have this very strong current of being faithful while displaced, of waiting on sort of God's justice, and go ahead.
And a certain amount of, you're in captivity because of your treatment of the marginalized and the injustice that was going on. That's part of God's bringing justice, is they're no longer free.
Right. And it's interesting. There's a ton to untangle there, and we're just flying over this, but it does kind of go in the face of this. What do I want to say? We're always so quick to ask what somebody else's responsibility is, and we're very not quick to ask what's our obligation, to others. And he quotes. Let me see here. I can't even find it. We'll just wait for that helicopter to fly overhead. Is it a helicopter or is it a car?
The helicopter.
Yeah. He talks about Jeremiah. Well, hold on. We'll give it a little bit of time for that to go over. All right. So, in Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 7, it's like, but seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. He goes on, the author, Kevin Nye, says, many people love and have memorized verse 11. For surely I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans for your welfare, not for harm, to give you a future and with hope. He says the word welfare, used in both verses and translated from the Hebrew word shalom, which connotes holistic peace and completeness, clues us into the larger message of the passage. The welfare that God has for us is not merely a general promise of happiness and fortune, but is instead directly tied to the welfare of everyone around us. Thoughts?
Yeah, that's one of those things, like, I've heard that verse 29:11 quoted a lot, but the context of captivity and the context of injustice, it gives you a different perspective when you realize that that's whom the people are at the time. They're the people who are in captivity, not the ones in power.
Yeah. No, and it's disorienting, and I think that's what he's trying to get at. And then we skipped ahead, but this is where he starts talking about grace and John Wesley and everything. And the whole point that he wraps up with that says, if God's grace is enough for us, then it is enough for anyone experiencing homelessness, whether they are in that position because of moral failures, difficult circumstances, or any combination of reasons. And I think that's good to get at. Oftentimes we want to weigh somebody and determine whether they're worthy of help. And sometimes we can do that because we want to know. Sometimes we do that because we know it'll give us an out for helping. We don't have to help. But I think, one, it's almost always going to be a combination. And two, it doesn't matter in the sense that what's our obligation community-wise to those who can't function in society? Some have very strong feelings about that, and others are trying to work and wrestle through that. And it's definitely complicated. He gets into that, but there isn't a sort of take that he has where he's like, oh yeah, those struggling with homelessness, it's completely out of their control. They have no say. And he's also, kind of not saying that this is all the fault of society or whatever. It's this sort of mixed bag.
Yeah.
And when we'll get into this as we go forward, this idea of how intertwined the trauma is with just even being homeless.
Yeah.
It's like I was just talking with a friend today about it, and talking about Brooke's interview where she had been homeless so long that it almost kind of deprogrammed her.
Yeah.
And so when she got out of homelessness, she had to be taught, like, hey, you need to take a shower every day. Yeah. You need to take care of your hygiene. You need to do this, and that. Like, she had to learn all over again.
Yeah.
Well, this is stuff that everybody knows. So how did she forget it? And it's because the truth of the matter is homelessness is very deprogramming. Mm-hmm. Isolation, all the stuff that comes with that has effects that you just wouldn't associate at first.
Yeah. So. Yeah, it definitely isn't. There's a lot to it. There's a lot to it, even in when somebody's housed, that they have to work through, and they need support, and they need community, and they need to have people in their lives that care.
The community is so critical. And for the people that might be listening, being like, I don't know what I can do for homelessness. I mean, sure, I can donate money to these organizations, or I can make food, or I can go give out, socks to people that need it. I mean, all that stuff is important. But one of the most critical things of bringing people in from the cold, so to speak, is relational. That isolation and the shame and, all that stuff that's involved with it, it starts relationally. It starts in how seeing somebody on the sidewalk, make eye contact with them. Yeah, sure, they might be acting weird or twitchy or talking to themselves or all that stuff. Just make eye contact with them, smile, like humanize them as you interact.
One of the things that I just highlighted the word deserve. And it kind of goes back to our topic of grace. But when you see someone and you think about it, like recognizing their humanity, and just, even if you don't know what to do, giving them that, like, they deserve that.
Yeah.
And we oftentimes look at them and we try to figure out in an instant what they deserve. Do I need to give them money? And he talks about that at some point in the book. He talks about, when do I do that and when do I not? And how do I factor all that in? And we'll probably talk about that more, but just how you view them can make a huge difference.
Yeah. Or how your posture toward them.
Yeah.
I mean, if somebody was going to listen to this and they're going to be done listening to this episode and that's the end of it, I would just say, like, just give a little bit of humanity in your interactions with those who are struggling with these things. Full stop. Just make eye contact. Be kind. They're going to be acting weird. They're going to smell. They're going to, whatever the issue is. But, like, if you want to know what's, like, the one thing that you can start doing now that actually does make a difference is treating them humanely, because this will surprise some people. They're human. They're people, So, and that goes in to chapter 1. So we're done with the introduction. Just short of
I think of so many stories that I've had over the last 9 years of being working in downtown, of just interacting with people who needed help, and how just it's so tempting to want to view them as an inconvenience.
Right. Dismiss
them. Be frustrated that they're there, and how natural that can feel at times. And that's really what it comes down to, though, is like, how do I check myself and check into the fact that they're human, and engage that part of them, and find that they'll engage you, and you may still need to find somebody else to help you, but
right. I mean, I'm not saying that that's going to solve the problem, but there is just this intense isolation that's just built into being homeless that changes the way people see themselves, the way they see the world. And when you step out and engage them as a human being of value, you're giving a little bit back to them. You are helping them ground themselves back to, like, society. And so many people don't want to do that, or they'll listen to them and be like, oh, they just want to be high. And then that's it. But the whole exchange for that was economic. You're there to go find out what their problem is and get and you're like, we're so quick to want to deny humanity to people that aren't living the way we want or who are a problem. And it's hard. I'm not going to lie. There's no easy part of this.
And that's why, like, I think a lot of the conversations in Lewis County right now that have happened have been so painful for people, is because it feels like we are at a crossroads of deciding how we treat people and as a community. And so there's a group of people that are basically wanting, how do we make this issue go away?
Yeah.
And then there's a bunch of other folks that are trying to say, this isn't just an issue. These are people. And no matter what you want to do policy wise, if we can't start there, we can't really work together. It's very difficult. And so it's like that's something, like, I wish that I could get that word out to people who may not even know where to start. At least start with not letting that slip by. Like, when people aren't acknowledging the humanity of it, don't let them get away with that. Don't let them get away with just dismissing that person as a junkie or whatever. Like, no, that is a human being who has gone through stuff you don't know.
Right. And even if you ask them, the answer that they're going to get, you're some stranger off the street. They're not going to open their heart to you necessarily. They're not going to, oftentimes they'll tell you what you want to hear. Yeah. Because they don't know what's going on with this interaction.
Well, and they are by far more vulnerable than we are.
Yeah. No,
I have a car. I go get in my car and I drive away. right?
Right.
Like they got nothing.
Yeah.
Sometimes,
And that is, you're right. We have to, there's starting points here, and none of it has to deny the issue. These are difficult issues. These are safety issues for our community. They are sanitary issues for the properties, that these are affected. All that stuff. Nobody's denying that. And that's what's so frustrating. But the way you engage, like, and I just recently came off of writing an article about this. So that's probably going to echo a lot in what I have to say. But this idea of, how do we help people who are in a very real way in self-destructive behaviors? And I made that comment that it's like they're slowly trying to kill themselves. Eventually it turns into a game of Russian roulette. Just a very long time before it takes effect. How do you help? And I don't think the answer is dehumanizing them. And I don't think the answer is increasing trauma. There's a lot, though, in there than how you do this.
Well, I have thought of that analogy before.
No, you didn't. I just made that one. I get all the credit for that.
Well, but not specifically in relation to what you said, but because I had heard somebody specifically talking about some of the harm reduction stuff that Gather does as putting bullets, giving somebody a gun to shoot themselves with. And I thought of it more as like if somebody you loved was playing Russian roulette, harm reduction is trying to take bullets out of the gun until they decide to put the gun down.
Right. Yeah.
And so a lot of times that's what it feels like we're doing, and it's really hard. But trying to help somebody not kill themselves, whether it's slowly or
right.
By giving them clean needles or
right.
fentanyl test kits and things like that.
And exchanging
and
needles.
Narcan.
This is one of my biggest frustrations with critics. I get not being on board. I get people being like, these programs, I don't think that they should exist. I can understand an informed critique, but of all of the things I've seen by the loudest opponents of these programs, they don't actually know how the programs work. They do not. No. And I know it's been explained to them. I know that they could take 10 minutes and go understand, but like the first thing, you can get me on a soapbox, the first thing that I always understood was, when you're dealing with somebody who is in opposition to you, can you state their viewpoint back in a way that they would agree with how you formulated it? Mm-hmm. And if the answer is no, you're not acting in good faith.
Right.
And I see that when people talk about needle exchange program and then they completely get it wrong. And they have no idea intentionally. Yeah. They have no idea. They make it sound like there's a drive-by with just chucking needles out of a old ambulance, or whatever. And it's terribly frustrating because how do you respond to somebody who's not even working the bare minimum to understand your argument in good faith?
Yeah.
And I want to say that I hope that I give them that fair shake, that I try to understand where they're coming from. And in many cases, I find that I'm not in disagreement with the problem or how they would state it. My disagreement comes in, what's the way to address this to protect the humanity of the people that are, quote unquote, the problem, Anyways.
Yeah. Well, going back to the analogy though, like how do you help somebody move from beyond that? And I think one of the big things that humanizing them in relationship does is it starts to give a spark of hope and a spark of life that's beyond what they've lived with. And that's the beginning of starting that journey to want recovery or to want to move on beyond that. And it's a long process and the system is very difficult, but it starts with that desire, right. And I think that's where I think in our debates, people wonder, how do you start that spark?
Yeah.
I think as a person of faith, I think you start that spark with hope. You start that spark with somebody recognizing you have worth. You're loved.
Grace.
There's something for you here. Grace. Yeah.
Unmerited favor.
Unmerited favor. You don't have to earn it. And I deal with people that are living in homelessness and experiencing that and all the other stuff. And they struggle. They struggle when something doesn't go right. They apologize profusely. Like these are people that the people I'm thinking of, they want help and they don't want to let you down. And I'm like,
there's so much shame tied up in this response.
And I just want to look at them like, you haven't done anything wrong. I'm like,
right.
I'm here
And
to help you.
and I don't think like,
I'm not saying that nobody's ever done anything wrong, but
no. And that's yeah. But I would say though, and I try to be clear that I don't speak for Gather. I try not to speak for Gather. I don't work for Gather. I support Gather. I'm an elder at Gather. And so like, but I've said this before, my opinions on these things and my theological opinions are probably, they're my own. They're not,
right.
They may or may not be shared by other members of Gather. So let's just say that. But when I look at how we begin to engage this process, when I look at the complexities involved of people who have histories, like you're talking about, they're trying to get help and you're helping them, and then they hit a roadblock and instantly they respond almost with shame and whatever. They've internalized the shame so badly. They're so apologetic. But, there's another side of it, which is that many of the services the Gather provides is almost completely made up of helping people navigate these opaque, bloated systems. And I think you experienced that. Matter of fact, I was just talking with Cole, who had expressed you're having some rough days because that system is so hard to navigate and so hard to get people lined up into. Now, Gather can't do the end of that. That's all we can do. The programs are just there to coordinate and to line up and to get all the stuff in a row so that when something is available, which is not a guarantee in any of this stuff, then the person has done the work and they're ready to just step into it.
Yeah.
Gather's lining up just tons of people. Next step to stepping into it is just completely out of Gather's hands, your hands,
Yeah.
And he said, you were struggling with navigating that system. So if we want to talk about why don't you just get people off the street, but you don't take a look how crazy and labyrinth-like these systems of navigating are? It's just, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, some of the stuff that I've experienced in the last year and a half, trying to help navigate and realizing it's not as easy when you don't have documentation of your existence.
Or a home, or a mailbox, or a phone, or a car.
You can't get a home or a phone or anything if you don't have ID.
Right.
And getting an ID when you don't have anything to prove who you are because you don't have an ID becomes a whole barrier. And, that's just one thing that feels like if I was on my own and homeless and out, to get started down that path would feel insurmountable. So, then to come find out people don't want me around, so,
right.
So it's, yeah, there's a lot there.
No. And that's what and there's so many pieces of this puzzle that have to come together to see everything to fruition that even if you do A+ at your job and get people to that point, they're not done and nothing's guaranteed. And the system that you just help them navigate is constantly putting up barriers to providing that help. And that's just one part of it. And that's not even navigating the personal side of it with the person that you're person or family. You work with families too.
Yeah.
Trying to get in and get that help, And I think, I don't know. So we haven't even gotten in chapter 1. We're just on the introduction. I think, maybe we'll push the next chapter into another episode because I do want to talk about, unless do you have any quote or anything that you had highlighted?
No.
Nope. Okay. The next chapter, we can lead into it a little bit, is on this idea of seeing and being seen. It talks about sort of the lenses through which we see things. And he uses stories of Jesus kind of turning that upside down on its head. But in your experience here in the work you do here, I mean, what's the greatest feeling of success you've had, and what's just the most demoralizing? Like, what are the outcomes that you see that encourage you and discourage you?
Oh gosh, I was talking about this the other day. Like, had a client who had to leave their housing and didn't have anybody to help. Living in a hotel, and their money ran out, and getting kicked out of the hotel. And we were able to, we got called to go in there and, do something. And they don't have, So
like your magic or something.
Yeah.
Like you
so
can just
I'm like,
conjure housing up.
There's a part of me that goes, I'm glad that there's somebody that they can call,
Yeah.
and it's not. And so we go in and had to navigate trying to connect this person to resources they already had, but they didn't have, their checks were getting mailed to a mailbox that didn't exist anymore. So I had to go and navigate with, the different social service providers that have those checks going out and try to get them to change addresses. Meanwhile, they don't have any money, so they're getting kicked out.
Right.
And then so waiting on that, like checking, calling, saying, hey, did the check get sent? Yes, the check got sent. Every day going to the mailbox and waiting. When that check finally came, I about jumped through the roof. Because it was in that moment I needed that.
And that's one reason why Gather provides mailboxes.
Yes. Because you can't get these things without an address.
Right. And it has to be a real one. It can be held at the post office.
Right. You can't put general delivery.
Yeah.
So we get mail for, Gather gets mail for, I don't know how many people, a lot. But by being able to receive that check, they were able to, then they had the funds then to pay for their hotel until they get some more housing. But so those are the kinds of moments where it finally happened, right? It was a week and a half later. That's how long it took to get from meeting them to.
And they were homeless during that week and a half.
Well, Gather was able to
get some temporary housing for them
to help with that. And that's hard, and
right.
And this particular person, she's 75. She outlived her kids, and
that has no help in this world.
Yeah. It's just one of those moments where I don't know where she would have gone, but getting that check was a huge win. I've had the demoralizing stuff is, I think for me, and this is where in chapter 1, he'll get into talking about the savior mentality. I think some of the more difficult experiences I've had this last year is when I haven't been able to help somebody, or when I've had to deliver bad news, because it makes me question my existence a little bit, as why can't I figure this out kind of deal, when it's really not me, and nor should I have been putting myself in the place of doing that. But, or when you're dealing with such complex issues that, it begins to feel hopeless. Calling people and having other people say, you need to call this number. You need to go call this person. And that's probably one of the experiences that people don't realize is so demoralizing for those who are experiencing homelessness, is they're told, call this number, and they call this number, and the person on that line says, actually, you need to call this number. And they pass them right back to the person who just told them they need to call that number.
Right.
And you do that a couple times as a sane person, as somebody who's not dealing with any substance issues, you just go, well, what
am I supposed to do with this? Yeah.
I'm not going to, and
it's not a sane system.
No. So those are the kinds of things that, when somebody's desperate and you're just kind of going, oh man, it's hard.
Yeah. And I would imagine, we've talked about this in regards to a lot of the work that goes on around here, but that idea of secondary trauma, your desire is to help people get off the streets, to get help, to get lined up. And you do all that work and it doesn't line up, or you get that, passed around from one thing to another, or whatever. You have really discouraging days. That's not just a trauma for the person who can't do it. It's a trauma for yourself as well, to a certain degree. You got to keep healthy boundaries, but it sucks.
Yeah. And watching someone kind of go through the highs and lows of feeling like, yeah, we're making progress, and yeah, we're going to find something to then not, and especially in like applying for housing, and dealing with people who have substance use disorders or mental health things that have been substantial, where they have barriers to housing. Watching them they got the funding now, but they're trying to apply to just find somewhere that will let them rent, and getting denied because of their barriers that probably stem from them being homeless. And, it's just like, it's such a crazy circle.
It's a feedback loop.
Yeah.
And like we said, the sort of deprogramming that happens being homeless and what that looks like. I guess that's what makes it so hard. So I don't work in this field. I work in the tech industry. This is what I do. And people are always like, what do you do? And I'm like, yeah,
and I've only been doing this for a year.
Right. But even then, looking from the outside looking in, so many of critics of things not working are completely ignorant of the actual work that's being attempted. It's a drive-by of like they haven't sat down, they haven't talked to you to find out how difficult it is to get somebody in a house. They haven't talked to Brooke to find out, well, why did you forget to, take care of yourself? All that stuff is not, I guess I get frustrated because it's like I said, you want people to, if someone's going to critique, if someone's going to, be like, I think you're doing this wrong or whatever, it'd be nice if they knew what it was that you did.
Right.
And how difficult it is. Also, how much is out of, your hands.
Yeah.
Like you can't go build a house for somebody. I'm sure you would if you could. You'd love to get people into housing. You'd love to, but like you're also at the mercy of an entire market and system that you don't control.
Well, and I feel like, in a lot of sense, I'm one cog in this machine that's trying to help. And Gather is really one piece in Lewis County so there's a whole bunch of people. If it was a matter of we could just go build houses, we probably would.
Yeah.
We got people to do it.
I think that's actually a great point because while Gather gets a lot of the heat for the work that's done here, that nobody mentions all the other organizations in our area that are doing the same work.
Right.
Like they're like, oh, this doesn't work. Are you saying that about everybody else? No, they're not saying that. They're just saying it doesn't work because Gather does it.
Yeah.
And that's frustrating too, because there's a lot of organizations doing the same work that you're doing that are putting in the time and also doing, like, experiencing the same frustrations, the same barriers to getting all this stuff done. And I guess, I'm glad that they don't experience that because it's not fun. I see the effect it has on staff. I see the effect that it's hard to endure while you're trying to help people.
Yeah. And they're dealing with it too. I mean, they see the public stuff and it's frustrating, I'm sure, even if it's not pointed directly at any one person or like, it's still hard.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of eyes. And that's part of the struggle about the very public, very uninformed hot takes that are out there. And like I said, I can respect an informed opinion where somebody's like, I just don't like it. I can respect that. It's so little work to just try to figure out what's the basics before you get into the fighting that so many are not doing. Like I said, I work in tech sector. Like this is not my thing, but I've taken the time to go, read a few books, to go look up the stats, to go just dig into it a little bit. It doesn't take a lot. It just takes good faith effort. And so many drive-bys don't even have that.
And that's one of the beauties of a book like this, because he is going to get into some of the policy stuff and touch on what works and what has been seen to work and how that plays into, a Christian faith, but I think also evidence-based practices are evidence-based, so
absolutely.
But yeah, it's something I think that if more people had the desire to understand how hard it is, it could change the way they view people, and the way it's yeah.
Yeah, and let's just go that full direction. Go ahead and be completely opposed to these programs, services, all that other stuff. That's a person's, they can do that. But I feel like we can't just allow this ongoing dehumanization of like really anybody in our community. Certainly not those who have no power, those
Right.
that don't have any assets to their name, don't have ID, living, in squalor, living in their own filth. Like, I just.
And that's where I think, like Kevin Nye and like the book, he's coming to it from a perspective of looking like, who did Jesus go to and who did he love, and what does that, how does that inform the way that we engage our community and the world around us? And it's just, and if it was easy, then Jesus probably wouldn't have died.
Yeah, I don't know. It doesn't seem like a lot of people are getting executed by the state around here, but I think you're right though. One of my favorite authors, Dale Allison Jr., he's a New Testament scholar. He talks, he's pretty critical. He is a Christian, but he's incredibly critical of what we can know and what we can't. But he talks about Jesus and what we can know about Jesus' expectations. How much can we know inside, Jesus' mindset? But one thing that we can look at is his actions, and whatever he thought about the world, whatever he thought about God, this idea, he brings up the concept of Jesus kind of referring to God as Father, Abba. That's a quirk to Jesus specifically. Whatever it was, though, it didn't drive him out of the world. It drove him further into the world.
Mm.
And, he set about to make things right now where he could. And I think these topics are big. These systems are huge and impenetrable. They're, a maze. There's so much work to be done. There's so many people that are homeless. We just had hotels closed. We got more people dumped out on the streets. We got people living in vehicles. We got people living out, at Blakesley Junction. We got all this stuff, right? It's a mess, and it can be overwhelming. So I just take it back to this idea of grace. What's the one thing that we can do? What's the one thing within our control? And that's how we respond and our posture toward basically everybody. That includes enemies, sadly. But it includes enemies. It includes those experiencing homelessness. It includes those that are just completely out of their mind on drugs. That grace thing, which is going to underwrite all of this book, and that's why he called it Grace Can Lead Us Home, is going to be a recurring theme. And like I said, we talked about this at the very beginning. I think there's a lot of value in this book, even if you're not a Christian. So if you're not a Christian, I would encourage you to listen to the podcast or read the book. It's quick, it's short. It's going to be way shorter than listening to us talk about it. And just like understand the sort of evidence-based stuff that he's bringing into this, and different ways of changing those lenses of how we view people experiencing these things. If you're a Christian, just be open to let it challenge some of our assumptions that we make, theological or otherwise, about people, about responsibilities and obligations or whatever. And if you're a Christian who's maybe already doing this work, it's still a value in terms of making you realize you're not alone. That the problems you face every day, Nate, are universal across our country and, all places where they're experiencing this.
Yeah. And I think one of the beauties of working at Gather is I get support from the faith community around me, and that I'm not alone. And there may be Christians who are working for other organizations even in Lewis County or other places that don't have that. And, I hope that, like you do feel connected to that and supported in that. And that I think the Christian faith can be a tremendous motivator for this kind of work and care and grace, radical grace. And
it's so important too for people who are outside that Christian circle to recognize that maybe it might challenge your view of what you think Christians think about stuff. It's not a homogenous group of people that are all on the same page, surprisingly. And that there are people of faith out there working in these ways and trying to understand the complexities of the situation that are different from maybe the loudest, most vocal Christians you've heard in our area or whatever. Anyways, all right. Well, we got through an introduction. Didn't even get in chapter 1. I just think this would be good though.
I wondered how it would go. It's like
you never know.
I could see.
I don't plan it. Just like the interviews. When I do interviews, I let the person figure out how they want to tell their story, and then my whole take on it is just to give them space to tell their story. I'm not there to critique their story or frame it or shape it or whatever. And same thing with these discussions. It's like a discussion. You let it go where it goes. Ideally, we will cover one section per episode, but it's hard, especially when you're doing the introduction, especially when you're engaging in all these things and his personal story a little bit, which comes out more. Mm-hmm. But no, I think this is exactly, what I set out to do. This is just discussing these things and letting people know that, they're both, it's complicated. It's messy. It's sad. It's encouraging, inspiring.
It's uncomfortable at times.
Yeah, totally. And that's people who don't work in this field or just somebody who's on the outside looking in. It doesn't hurt to understand it a little bit more. So, well, Nate, I'm looking forward to having you co-host with me. This is, I think, going to be a lot of fun. Also probably going to be a lot of work, reining in our things on this book. I know I've purchased multiple copies of this book. I've given them out to people. I know that we have several people here that have purchased copies to give out to people. And that's spread to others who have purchased their own copies. And so there's been copies kind of just thrown out throughout the community. I would encourage anybody that's listening to the podcast, if you want a copy of the book, you can afford it, let me know. We will get you a copy, on me. And I do think it's a good resource for people. I think it's worth reading. You don't even have to agree with it, but it's good at least to start the conversation. So, anyways, Nate, I'm looking forward to this. I think we're going to have a good time, and we've got I don't know how many chapters there are, 8 or 9 more to go. So this will be a good series. I do have an interview that I will eventually line up. It might break up the series a little bit, but for the most part, this is what we're going to tackle for the foreseeable future. So I appreciate you being here, and I appreciate you sharing your experience.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for letting me come and be a part of it and get to share that and be a part